Hi everyone, this is our first poetry video, our first of six, where we'll be talking about two poems in each video. Today is the first with William Butler Yeats' The Lake Isle of Innisfree and William Carlos Williams' The Red Wheelbarrow. Just as a reminder from what you've read in the prompt and from what I've explained already, we are reading these poems first and foremost to practice in our own writing particular skills that these poems reveal to us or show us or are examples of. So that is our first priority. Second priority is just practice reading poems and figuring out what they're about, what their stories are. Maybe even start figuring out what their argument is or what kind of message that they have for us, because that will help prepare us for our final essay, How Does a Poet Make Meaning? But the first goal, again, learning the style skills that these poems exhibit so that we can imitate them in our own writing. So I'm going to pull up the poems and we're going to talk about William Butler Yeats's first, and then we'll get into the William Carlos Williams after that. So you're a little bit more familiar with this poem now that you've read it and recorded it, and you might even start and have a good understanding of what it's about. We're going to read it again, and then I'm going to call your attention to some important skills to take away from this short poem. Before I get into it, I want to say that the overview of both of the poems we'll read today, Lake Isle of Innisfree and Red Wheelbarrow, we are going to have kind of a primary goal in mind about what these poems do. They do two things. I would call them, they invite the reader into the scene. So us as readers, we can read the Lake Isle of Innisfree and we can feel as if we're there at Innisfree. We can sense and physically picture ourselves with our imagination to be there. So we're going to talk about this poem today, inviting us into the scene, to experience the scene. And then the same thing with Red Wheelbarrow, that we're going to be invited into the scene through a visual picture or imagination with what is described. So the second thing that we're going to talk about, though, is the classic saying that I'm sure you've heard before, which is show, don't tell. So writing should show, not tell. It should allow the reader to experience what is being talked about instead of being told what is talked about. And so that's something we're going to make sense of as well, and what you're going to carry into your first writing exercise called details, physical senses. So first I'm going to read this poem, and then we're going to break it down a little bit. The Lake Isle of Innisfree. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. Will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway, or on the pavement's gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. As you learned from Edward Hirsch's How to Read a Poem, one of the first things you want to do is just figure out what the story is. What is this poem about, literally? Sometimes when we jump in to start reading poems, we have the tendency to figure out what they symbolize, or they're a metaphor for something, or if they represent something else. And though poems do that, they also have an initial and literal story at play. And the story here is pretty simple. There is a man who lives in the city. We know that from his reference to the roadway and pavements gray. And while he's in the city, he's just imagining what it would be like in Innisfree. He's even telling himself that he will go there now. And he's imagining what he'll do there, what it'll be like there, and how he'll experience it. And that's the basic story. Pretty simple. Um, what I want to focus on today are these physical details, the things that invite the reader into the scene. Two things. Specificity invites the reader into the scene. So when we have things like a small cabin built there of clay and wattles made, he gets specific. He doesn't say, I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree and build a house there and live alone in the Beloud glade. He gets specific about how the cabin is built. He's specific about how many bean rows. And even saying bean rows is much more specific than saying garden, for instance. Um, he doesn't just explain one time of the day, he explains or describes the morning, midnight, and noon. So he's capturing as much specificity as he can. And that's one way that he invites us into the scene. Um, with that said, the description of specific things, we want to look at the nouns of this poem just to make sense of something that I find very important. So even if we go through the nouns and underline them. So let's just do that. I, Innisfree, cabin, clay, wattles, bean rows, I, hive, honeybee, glade, I'm going to bold this and come back to it. Peace is definitely a noun here. Veils, morning, cricket, midnight, noon, glow. Glimmer is a noun. Evening, linnet is a bird. If you didn't look that up, again, one of the things that you can do when you read a poem is look up words that you don't know or that you think you know, and want to make sure you have the right definition for. So we're getting plenty of nouns here. Lake, water, skip the I, get plenty of that. Sounds, shore, pavement, roadway, heart, core, and then just a couple more I's. It's a good exercise to do, to see the amount of nouns that I underline, physical things, objects, versus what I bolded with peace, which is an abstract thing. Peace you cannot see, peace you cannot taste or touch or smell. It's a quality that we only know through maybe experiencing things that are peaceful. That, of course, then would be the physical things that are mentioned in this poem. So one of the things I want you to take away from this poem today is just seeing not only the specificity of the nouns, but the nouns themselves being physical things, not abstract things. This is the distinction between show, don't tell. William Butler Yeats does tell us twice in this one line that he'll have peace there. But really he didn't need this line. You can imagine even that he didn't have this line in the poem at all. Cut it out. And I'm telling you that we could still read this poem without reading this line, and I could ask you, how do you feel? And you would say, peaceful. Why? Because you can imagine yourself on this lake island. You can imagine yourself at this cabin that's in nature and just noticing the beauty and serenity of nature around you, and you would say peaceful. So it's his description of the place that says something about how he feels about it, what he thinks about it, what it means. but he doesn't necessarily need to come out and tell us how he feels about it or what he thinks about it. Even though he does in this one place, if we see the ratio of underlined nouns to these nouns, it's very important. So as you go into writing your first description, I don't want you to tell me how you feel about the topic that you've written about. And we already know that the topic you're writing about is something you take pleasure in, that you enjoy. I don't need you to tell me that. I need you to describe it in a way where I will look at the description and say, oh, I know how they feel about that. They feel this way, or they feel that way, or this way. So that's the first thing we can take away from this poem. Now, one other thing I want to talk about. I gotta get out of here. Okay. I want to talk about physical senses, the 5 physical senses. What are they? Sight, touch, smell, taste, and hearing. One of the ways we get to experience this scene is that Yeats's description of the scene calls attention to different senses that we have. And when our different senses are being activated, we know that we are experiencing something physical and real and concrete. So as you look through this poem and look through other poems, you always want to be asking yourself, oh, what senses are being evoked? And you want to think about that in your own writing as well. So for instance, let's take sight's the obvious one, because most of the things that are described in a poem could come back to sight. So even something like a hive for the honeybee, we could see a hive, we could see a honeybee. A small cabin, we could see a cabin, right? So sight is almost a given. And however, these other ones are a little bit more subtle, but they're embedded even into these descriptions that I just touched on. So a hive for the honeybee, what other sense might we give to that? Well, I think about a honeybee and I think about hearing it, hearing the buzz of it. I think of a hive and I think of that kind of hive and honeycomb texture. And so when I'm thinking about texture, I'm thinking about touch. Same thing with the small cabin. It's made of clay and wattles. Clay is something you can feel. Wattles is, I don't know. I actually don't know what wattles is. That's something we need to look up. But something that you can feel, that you can touch. So we have this sense of touch in hive and clay and wattles. Hearing, we have in Be Loud Glade. There's actually a lot of hearing in this poem. Be Loud Glade. Cricket singing. Evening fold the linnet's wings. That means the wings are flapping, and you can hear the flapping of the wings. He tells us that he hears lake water lapping with low sounds. He tells us that he hears something in his heart's core. So we get a lot of hearing in this. We can ask ourselves, do we get smell or do we get taste? Yeah, sure. When I think about a honeybee, I think of taste. Maybe not a ton of smell in here, but you get the point. That you need to be thinking about writing with physical specificity, but also breaking down that physical specificity into different senses. And you want to capture those senses because that invites the reader into an experience, the kind of experience that if they actually went to the Lake Isle of Innisfree, they would have, because their 5 senses are tuned in to what's going on around them. So those are the 2 lessons for Lake Isle of Innisfree. Show, don't tell. Show through physical specificity. Show through descriptions that evoke these 5 senses. And in doing so, invite your reader into the scene, to an understanding of your topic, whether it's an action or a thing. Let's go to the red wheelbarrow. We're just going to touch on this one really quickly because this does something a little bit different. If we say that in the first poem, Yeats uses description to represent an emotional quality of peace, which he didn't need to say, but he does. What can we say about the red wheelbarrow? Is that also description and physical detail that is standing in for an emotion or representing an emotion? Or is it representing an idea? Show, don't tell still applies here. You can tell someone how you feel, but you You can also tell someone how you think about something. And instead, we want to use our descriptive writing skills to show. So let's read this poem, very short, and then talk about it. The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rain water beside the white chickens. We get physical specificity. A wheelbarrow that is red, an image of it being kind of misted or glazed with rainwater, so it's just rained. There's white chickens. So we get this specific description, but we can also imagine some things that are going on around it. It's on a farm of some sort. It has just rained, and that rain seems to have maybe stopped. And that's some of the story we get through that description. Now, what is this poem doing? You heard Edward Hirsch talk about it a little bit. What I like best of what Edward Hirsch did is he asked a simple question of poetry or of poems, and specifically of this poem. What does this poem value? That's another way to kind of talk about show, don't tell. This poem does value something, meaning you could go to William Carlos Williams and say, what did you mean by so much depends upon it? And he might answer you. He might answer you by saying something like, well, so much depends on these simple things. So much depends on farm life. So much depends on imagery. And we heard Edward Hirsch talk about that. So much depends on these simple observations. But he didn't say that. Instead, he gave us an image to represent what he wanted to say. So there's room for interpretation here, but the idea of show, don't tell still applies. Instead of saying what he wants the red wheelbarrow to represent, he gives us the red wheelbarrow so that we can ask questions about what qualities the red wheelbarrow glazed in rainwater represent, and then put that into that formula of so much depends. And so here he's saying what he thinks with imagery, with description, physical things that we can physically sense and experience. So that's all for this first poem reading video. You're going to take these skills into your first writing assignment. You're going to describe your topic with as much physical specificity as you can, and with as little statement about what you feel or think about it. Let the description reveal those thoughts and feelings. So, have fun with it. Sorry. Let me get back to video so you can see me. Have fun with it. Do your best to describe in as much detail as possible, with the goal maybe of just helping me, as I read it on the computer screen, really put myself in the scene. I can close my eyes and I can sense that I am touching this object that you're describing, or I could sense that I'm seeing this object that you're describing, or I can sense the action that you're describing as if I'm doing it myself. That is the goal, and I can't wait to read those. Until next time, bye.